All right, we're recording. This is April 7, 2021, and we've got plenty to get through for the agenda today. A couple items from Mark first. I know, Mark, you've been working on a blog post for the Kubernetes blog that's kind of introducing Gateway API.
Yeah. So we wanted to make sure that we got one of the goals. We want to get a blog post on the Kubernetes blog before KubeCon, just to generate some buzz. Now that I think this is probably a good time to start being more vocal. I'm in the process of writing it right now. What I was going to do is later today. I was just going to open the doc, post issue in the Gateway chat, and people can give it LGTMs. What I was planning on doing is basically asking for each of kind of the major contributors here to put their name on it, and so we could get, in the authors list, it would basically be, one or two people from each company that's kind of been contributing to it, so that'll be kind of at the blog post. So it just kind of shows that it's a multi-vendor kind of thing. But anyways, yeah, that was pretty much it. So I was gonna post that later today and ping some people on that.
Awesome, that's great. Yeah, it feels like leading up to KubeCon in the next, I guess, few weeks, we're really going to have a lot more content out around Gateway. And I think that's going to cause more people to pay attention and maybe get some more involvement here, some more people testing out implementations. And so excited to see what comes of that. But yeah, thanks for taking the lead on a blog post here. The next item is Gateway Service Policy. And this came out of a kind of an internal discussion from within Google, where we were trying to decide how can we attach all the different policy that we might want to this API. And ideally, how can we do it in some kind of generic enough way that it's also applicable to the community as a whole? And Mark, you wrote, I think, all of this, so maybe you have a bit more background on what you're thinking here.
Yeah. If you just want to go, just scroll down a little bit. I'm just going to go through this. So this has been, yeah, it's perfect. This has been the issue that I've been concerned about from the start, which is basically the bullet points here detail it. Like, some level of proprietary capabilities are used for every single gateway controller. It doesn't matter which one it is. They all have proprietary capabilities, because as businesses, we want to provide, unique things that are unique to our implementation that are valuable, right? So it's inevitable. And if you look at it, usually the number of proprietary configuration and policy fields actually exceeds the number of core fields in the Gateway API. Like the number, like even if you just look at Nginx Ingress, which is kind of the canonical example, just for I think it was for timeouts, for connection timeouts, there's like 5 different varieties available. And so overall, the number of proprietary knobs, exceeds the number of things that are standardized. And so it is a pretty big problem, or this is an important problem to solve. And ultimately, if Gateway doesn't provide a way to connect these proprietary things in all the ways they need to be layered onto the API, I feel the Gateway API will fail as a standard, because companies, if there's going to be one thing a customer wants that you're able to do in your custom API, but you can't represent as easily in Gateway, you're going to end up supporting 2 APIs forever. And that's going to cause more strain in engineering, and it's not going to make sense. And so ultimately, while Gateway was this shiny thing that promised compatibility across the board, if it doesn't do that 100%, then all these companies will end up supporting 2 separate APIs. And yeah, so that's the rationale for why this is important. Further on is, I use the word policy in this doc, but it's super overloaded term. I'm just talking about traffic, mostly traffic settings, but some security things. All these things like retries and timeouts and health checking and backoffs and circuit breaking and capacity stuff, load balancing algorithms. It does kind of overlaps somewhat with security things, but it's mostly traffic stuff that you kind of find on a lot of these implementations. So that's the scope of what this is about. keep on going down. So there's basically 3 goals. Well, I guess I'll just pause and see if there's any questions so far.
Yeah, maybe it's more of a comment. You gave kind of the traffic timeouts and as an example a few different times for the driver for this document. So that I had created a PR early on. It's still there because we were kind of going back and forth. Like, does this belong along a Ford 2, or does this belong in a back end? And it's still kind of been up for debate. So I guess what I'm getting at is, like, maybe the document goes through this later on, but it'd be nice to kind of collect like a list of like really specific requirements, where it sounds like this one kind of connection timeouts is like one of those requirements, but that is a requirement that we've been kind of going around trying to figure out what's like the best place for connection timeout settings to live. And I think it's just been on a back burner as we've been focused on implementations in some of these other areas.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's ultimately what we can put in the core API are the things that all the vendors do similarly, right? If everybody supports the configuration of connection timeouts at the granularity level or at the scope of like an individual service, and the semantics of the timeouts all mean the same things between us, well then great, it can go in the core API, right? And like things like path matching and header matching are unambiguous, and they're implemented in the same way across all of our implementations, and so that's why those things can go in the core. But as you look at the long tail of features, there's less and less things, or there's like differences that are different enough that make them very challenging to put in core, because it will suit one company well and it'll suit another company poorly. And so this is really about, and I'm not sure what the list is, because I think there's still a long list of things that do belong in core that are not there yet. Health checks, I think, might be one example, because I feel like the parameters for health checks are somewhat uniform across different implementations, but other things are not so much. And so this is the scope of this is focused on those custom parameters and how to extend the API with those things. So the goals for this proposal are: one, we want to provide a standardized way of extending arbitrary and proprietary configuration across the core resources. We want to provide the ability to do this arbitrary and proprietary policy across different scopes, because different implementations also they implement it in the different scopes. For whatever weird reason, in GCP, health checking can only be applied at basically the service level. So you couldn't do it any more granularly. And if you had multiple, like if you have, it's caused all kinds of issues because there's mismatch. But basically, it points to the fact that like we've implemented things at different levels, and so it does require the ability to attach policy at different levels as well. There's also kind of a policy-based element here where some people want to maybe implement some things like a default, like a connection, like a timeout default at the gateway level, so that don't have to be implemented on a per service basis, which makes it a lot more kind of laborious for users. And then the third one is that this is an arguable goal, is to provide a way for these policies to compose, so that if the same parameter is configured at multiple levels, that there is standardized logic on how this actually gets collapsed into a single effective parameter that actually gets applied. So I'll go a little bit down to the picture, and this kind of will just show like all the different scopes, right? Something could be, you could set, we'll just take maybe health checks as an example. Maybe you could set health checks at the gateway class as like a default health check that always gets applied. Or maybe they're set at the gateway. Maybe they're set on the route. Maybe they're set on the route rule, which is like, the forward to. Maybe they'll set on the service. Maybe they're set on the subset of the service. There's many levels from broad to granular across which any of these configuration fields could apply, and they'll be valid and not valid for different implementations. Okay.
Yeah, I think this is a really good. Yeah, I think this is a really good point, and it kind of lines up with what Danian was saying earlier too. We were really struggling with where policy belonged, right? You could make an argument, well, you might want to have a default timeout for an entire class, you know, that, or you might want to have a timeout on a route rule, or you might want to have it attached to a specific service, whatever it happens to be. You can imagine that you want to have these kinds of config attached at different points. And although this doc and this concept is really tied to how we might want to attach, you know, kind of implementation specific policy, I think there's a lot of overlap with even policy that finds its way into the core API. We're struggling with these same issues of where does it belong? And can we, you know, provide a standard way that you can attach at multiple points? So yeah, anyway, I think this is a good diagram.
Yeah. Okay, so let's actually get to the meat of it. By the way, this doc is linked in the notes if you want to get to it yourself. Okay. Okay, so let's Rob, why don't you go a little further down to the actual I think the example. Oh, okay, we'll stop here. So basically, proposing, and the names maybe should be different. So there's a couple different ways how like standalone policy resources, column configuration resources get attached to services. In GKE Ingress, we happen to have a model that I don't like very much, where the service resource has an annotation that references this policy resource. And it's basically, so service references to the policy resource. There's other ones where the backend policy that we already have, that goes the other way. So the backend policy references the service. Like if you look at something like the destination rule for Istio, it is policy. It's basically a standalone policy resource that references the service by the host name of the service, which is a very different way of doing it. So I looked at all these, and one of the things I did like around the resources referencing the policies is that you can trace the all the policy that affects everything by just going through the Christmas tree of different resources, and you can basically go look at the service, look at the resources it references, and then you can understand, you can write it down on paper and you can understand what policy is affecting it. Whereas if you have like the backend policy that we have today in the Gateway API references the other way, and you can't do that unless you know about that resource yourself. So it's a little bit harder to trace. So anyway, so I have this, so I propose that there's this policies field, and that this policies field should exist at multiple levels within the Gateway API, maybe even multiple levels within the same resource. So for instance, it could exist under the forward to. It could also exist kind of on the route itself. It could exist on the service, the gateway, or the gateway class. And the policies field is a list that allows it to reference arbitrary CRDs. These are basically policy CRDs. Here's one that we would have for GCP, and I'm just calling a service policy CRD. And these CRDs have any kind of config in there that is specific to implementation. It doesn't matter what the structure is. We control it fully on our own. And I think, Rob, go down to maybe the next, I think the next YAML after this. I think the full example. So here's an example of basically, let's say in our service policy, we have a minimum TLS version. And so I've created basically 3 different service policy resources. And and then I've referred to them on the gateway. Now, this was totally inspired by the TLS, how TLS is designed in the gateway right now, where there's basically an override. So any resource can reference a policy, and then it can also, allow or deny policy override, which basically means any resources, any gateway API resources southbound of it can or cannot override that policy resource and the fields in that policy resource. So this example basically shows it references two of the same CRDs, right? Both service policy CRDs of the same API group. One is set that it allows policy override. So the gateway foo policy, it allows it. The gateway default policy, it denies it. And so if you look at the gateway default policy, it's like, okay, HBS redirects, true, limit connection. So those things cannot, those fields cannot be overridden. And the gateway, the fields in the gateway foo policy can be overridden. And so this allows policy to compose. So it allows policy to be set at multiple different levels, and then kind of it's starting from the highest level, which is like the gateway class to the gateway to the route to the service. Each one at the highest level gets to define whether they are having something that can be overridden or not. So this flexibility, it allows totally arbitrary configuration to be applied at multiple levels. It allows it to compose such that we can use like the exact same policy resource at multiple levels. Not every field in your implementation has to even be supported at that level. Like there may be an instance where, like, perhaps for your implementation, SSL policy, just you can't configure it at the granularity of an individual service. Maybe something that's only can be configured at the granularity of a gateway. That's fine. In your documentation, you would not allow it to be configured at other levels. It would be basically an error or something. So, Robbie, if you go to the next picture, this just shows a diagram of what this all looks like. So yeah, so it's basically showing there's policy fields within each of these resources, and it's just showing how they all compose together to one effective list of configurations that apply to a specific service. So that's the gist of it. I think it's a little rough, but it's just one proposal. I don't know very many good ways to kind of achieve all the goals of all the flexibility we need without also totally killing the UX. So I'm open to ideas or suggestions.
Hey, Mark, I like how you brought up, you said, it's like a Christmas tree, right? Where you could look at a service and then reference a service policy and just start connecting the dots from there, right? I like that. Brought up like the example of like minimum TLS. And so that, as an implementer, it's something that I thought about. And there's, I believe it's the options field in the TLS config where it is meant to be kind of like implementation specific options that can be passed. And I always thought about using that for Contour to specify things like minimum TLS, and look at the gateway class, and it references a CRD, which is meant for implementation specific parameters. I just mentioned options and TLS config. So we have kind of all these different extension points. And I just wonder if we need to go back and like look at these use cases that you describe as use cases for something like service policy, and maybe circle back to these extension points and say, okay, did we miss something here? Kind of just looking at it, look at the issues you're bringing up broadly, so that we can go back and say, do we need to remove some of these extension points and just use service policy? I guess just generally look at those extension mechanisms, look at it broadly, look at the extension mechanisms we have, and say, why aren't these extension mechanisms meeting these use cases you described? And if they're not, should they even exist?
Yeah, And now, one thing I want to be wary of is not to turn this into a dumping ground for all configuration, because like it could easily just become this massive CRD that basically has everything in it. And like like gateway API resources have a very structured shape because they're built for the specific UX of the use cases, which is like configuring load balancing. And like I definitely think this should basically just be for things that just can't be standardized. Like maybe like for instance, it's basically just for extended stuff, because I think that for maybe there are TLS options that do belong there. Like if we all like everybody has an SSL policy that they support in the kind of a similar way, well then that does belong in TLS options because that's where it makes sense. And also then you can have it in line, which is always an advantage to have it in line as opposed to another resource. So yeah, so I think like the more ubiquitous and common something is, the more we should look at trying to keep it in something core. But if that just can't be done, this is a way to give us that escape hatch to really kind of provide that arbitrary configuration. But we shouldn't abuse it. So it's a balance. And I agree, we should go back and because this may invalidate certain extension points that we currently have if this was something we pursue.
So one of my thoughts on this is that it potentially helps solve one of the problems we've seen throughout is we have a lot of policies, like Danian, you mentioned timeout, where it was unclear where we might want to attach that. Like, okay, maybe it belongs on backend policy, maybe it belongs on the route, or maybe it's something like that should be a default for the entire gateway or the entire gateway class. Like you could make an argument that it belongs at any of those points. And the model I like here, and I'm not sure, again, I haven't thought about this enough, but the idea I really like what we did with TLS, right? Where you have the ability to set something like on gateway and then to allow resources south of it to override that. So in this case, you could set defaults for say timeout or I don't know, health checks, whatever kind of things might be included in this kind of resource, and then override them at lower levels if routes differ from the norm or if backends are somewhat different, right? And this kind of structure seems like it could be applicable to more than just implementation specific policy, but maybe even, like maybe this replaces what we have for backend policy right now. I don't know, but I just thinking out loud ways that we could rethink this a little bit and maybe apply these kinds of options more generically to not just one specific resource, but at different points in the stack.
So one thing I would say about extensions and the filters is I'm hesitant to simply remove them. It's more that if you use this style of policy, it does have this kind of semantic meaning of overriding. E.g., if you use a filter or an extension, it's kind of 100% custom. And then it's up to you as the implementer of those things to kind of explain how they work to the user. But for this, there's a particular API contract that we are espousing. Is my audio okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So, but yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It's kind of like if this is the extension that you use for a particular configuration, then you are also, you're honoring the fact that it has to apply to all these override policies and things like that. You use a different field, it doesn't have that meaning, and so you don't get that override. We could also use in addition to third-party CRDs to represent this policy, the backend policy could basically take this kind of form as well. So there is maybe a standardized one. But I definitely favor inline stuff as much as possible, because it just makes it easier than having a ton of different resources. So wherever we can put things in line in a core resource is definitely preferable if it's possible.
Yeah, like I think going back to we can't simply remove those extension points, is I think those serve a slightly different purpose. Like if you think about filter, it's kind of, for example, let's say we take all filters and replace them with policy. Like probably 95% of filters don't make sense to have this sort of inheritance model. And then you'd have to explain, well, actually you can't attach it at the gateway. It probably doesn't make sense. So yeah, the two do serve different purposes. Mark,
Yeah.
is there in your proposal how to display the compose policy to users? Like how do they understand that? Because that is basically the killer for these kind of models. And like the best thing I've seen is your CSS debugger in your browser that tells you exactly where things are coming from.
That's very much, yeah, no, there isn't. I mean, there's an example of how, like, of what the effective policy is given. I think, Rob, there's that box that shows like 3 different policies. It's like a 3x3 box somewhere. There you go. So we, like, this shows, with different ones are overriding it or denying the override at different levels, and it shows kind of what the effective policy is. There does need to be a way to provide this to the end user, like basically the service owner needs to be able to understand this in some way. I don't have a proposal how that should be done yet, but I agree that's necessary, because otherwise they will set a policy field on their service. They will not know that at the gateway level, override is set to deny and nothing happens, right? And that's confusing UX.
Yeah, the challenge I think with this proposal, and it does make sense to me, is like how much do we need to say explicitly as to the behavior versus the underlying system has a particular behavior? Like, is it the case that policy composition is, we can write generic code, kind of like how the validation PR, where basically we describe the resolution like 100%. Like it is just a generic piece of code that goes with like the gateway API, and everyone is going to behave the same, versus that there is some need to have some nuance and have the implementations understand something different. Obviously, the first one is great because then we can just fully document the behavior, and that's that. The second one is like, well, if your system has some specific implementation that if it understands these overrides, for example, in better, then it's better performance or something. That one's always challenging when building these portable layers.
Yeah, one way is to actually have, so in the status of the policy resource, it shows you the effective policy. That might be, it could be, I'm just brainstorming. That could be an interesting way to do it. So basically, like it would show you the effective policy at every level. So like if you create a policy that's referenced from a service, it shows you the effective policy at that level. If you create a policy resource at the HTTP referenced from the HTTP route, the status shows you the policy at that level, which actually would be different than the service level.
I think the problem we run into, I think the problem we run into there is that we have, the same policy could be referenced by multiple resources in different, chains, basically different parts of the Christmas tree, let's say.
Dan, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
so, yeah, but I do think status is probably our first and best way to communicate this. And what Bowie said about the CSS debugger brings back great memories. And yes, that feels very relevant to this kind of model.
So and we can structure a status to kind of have that CSS debugger flavor. What was I going to say? Shoot. Oh, right. So Mark, as part of this proposal, we are basically saying that we're going to stipulate like the merging happens in this very particular way. Like there is no flexibility about that because that makes it easy to describe to users. But of course, people are going to be like, well, I want to, write something more concisely, and we're going to have some more sophisticated merging. But I think we're precluding that for understandability purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal is to provide really black and white merging that is really easily understandable. Otherwise, we'll get into a kind of a quagmire. And I realize that I haven't really addressed kind of what this merging would look like because it's not clear whether it's like a deep merge, like is it going, if there's a struct inside this policy, what gets merged? The whole, at what level do things merge? And I think that's something that needs to be discussed. But so like alternatively, we could look at the exact same proposal, but take out the policy, the override part of it. And the problem, like I started with that originally, and the problem that I realized is just that if you happen to reference the same field in multiple layers, there's no obvious conflict resolution. And it's an easy thing to do because you have different people that are operating on the gateway or the route or the service. And so it's not like you could also then have entirely different policy resources at each level, but then you have a unique CRD type at each level, which is just kind of annoying to have to deal with all that complexity. So this felt like the simplest option out of all those, or at least the most straightforward one out of all those different ways of doing it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's a lot of promise here, but I guess maybe we need to sketch it out more, give more time to think about it. But I was really interested in this, and I wanted to make sure we had some time to discuss it today because a lot of the things, coming up on our agenda, on the OOT 3.0 milestone are in some way related to policy or where they might fit. Like Damian mentioned, the idea of timeouts, retries, also in the same area, health checks, and trying to figure out how we attach these concepts seems very relevant to this discussion, even if it's not exactly the same mechanism. Wanted to at least get this out there and see if there's any overlap and if this idea makes sense. But yeah, this is a great doc. Thanks for getting it together.
And really quickly too, I mean, Robbie kind of bring up the overlap. You brought up the backend policy earlier, and I do. I mean, that's definitely a concern that it's like the amount of overlap. I mean, should we then get rid of backend policy if we proceed with service policy? I mean, initially it seems like that would be the case, and then just the concern I have of the extension points that we have, right? As an implementer, like would I use service policy here, or would I use one of these existing extension points to do that thing that I want to do? And so that's just a concern that I have is trying to decide where and when to use a service policy as opposed to the current extension points.
Yeah, I think we should definitely write out like what makes sense. I think extension points to me are very like physical. Like the filters is a good example. Like that one doesn't seem like we can do without. Probably this will supersede backend policy because they serve very similar purposes. We'd have to work out some of the referencing issues, which direction it goes in, who controls what.
Yeah, I think the big issue with backend policy references service or any other kind of backend, and that's all we can do because it's hard to add a field to service or other resources, but it's also a very confusing tree or lack of a tree in this case. It's not the direction users are really looking, and so if we can find a better way to attach at that level, then I think the attachment points at all the levels we do control, like routes and gateways, are much more straightforward if we do have something like this. And I'd agree, like filters, that this feels very separate from filters. I think filters are a very good extension point. We do have some other extension refs throughout the API that this may overlap with. I'm not sure. But yeah, we do need to
Like, I think
clarify.
one thing to clarify is that, is it the case that if you use one of these policies, it's going to be valid in all of, so Mark, your diagram here has like the little policy decorators at every layer. Like, is it the case that this thing means that it's valid at every layer? Or do we want to end up in a situation, well, it's like this one can decorate gateway, but actually it doesn't really care about inheritance because you actually can't plug it in those other places.
Yeah, I think that's, I think every single implementation is going to have configuration that is only supported at a few of the layers. Some will be like one layer. Like, I think your point about filters is a really good point, because filters really only make sense exactly where they are, right? At that one place inside the route. At least, in the route, somewhere in the route is the only place where filters really make sense. And so those, right, would never make sense for any kind of policy. And I think that this service policy does make sense for things that work at multiple layers, but I think it would be rare to find parameters that do work at every single layer. And so that is one kind of confusing aspect here, which is that you have, we get the benefit of having like a single uniform resource to configure this policy, so you don't have a bunch of different CRDs. But the downside is the individual fields in that resource may have different scopes upon which they're supported. Where like some things, are supported at the service or the route layer. Some things maybe make sense at the gateway and the gateway class layer and the route, but not lower than that. Which is something that I was thinking makes sense to fix through documentation. Through the implementation documentation, we would say like, here are the places where you can attach this field in the service policy. But yeah, I don't know if
and some status, right, to indicate an error. Like we can't.
Yeah.
Documentation, like people don't read documentation.
Right. Yeah, it would have to be. Yeah, status always helps, right? Status and or events to show that a field has been referenced at a particular scope that it's not actually supported.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. One last follow up on here. I know we've spent a good amount of time on this doc, and I do want to move on, but I wanted to make sure that we got some feedback from other implementers here. We obviously have our own ideas of the kinds of policy that we think would be useful to attach at different levels, but I'm interested in what other implementers are thinking about, let's say in this case specifically, implementation specific features, functionality, whatever, and how you might attach that to this API. Has that been something like that you've been thinking about as you've been writing other implementations? And no need to respond here, but if you have comments, I think Mark, you're going to file a issue to track this as well on Gateway API, and so maybe if we can just have more of a discussion there. But really interested in what others are thinking about how these kinds of extra details that may not fit inside core can be attached to the API.
Yeah, and I didn't jump in and respond right away because I wanted to give an opportunity for others to jump in. But of course, on the Contour side, to have myself and some of the other Contour maintainers of, we've been in the thick of things with the implementation. And a few of the use cases, Mark, that you mentioned, like I said, I've kind of thought through some of that, like using the TLS options field in TLS to express minimum TLS versions. Some of the connection timeout settings and so forth. That's been in the back of our minds, but I think, again, it hasn't been a high priority right now because of other areas of the implementation that we've been focused in on. But yeah, that's just an extension point that we as a community know needs to get addressed, and we've kind of just gone back and forth, like where is the right where's the right place in the APIs to express the connection settings, right? And so again, I think it really be helpful to kind of list out, hey, here's a use case, here's either why or why not the current APIs don't support the use case. Would be helpful, because at least where I'm at right now, the implementation, the extension points are working out. But again, we still have a long way to go in the Contour community for full support of Gateway API.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's really good feedback. I'll add a section in this doc in which we can track, the types of things that are appropriate for this kind of generic service policy, and things that are maybe better suited for, more specific or built-in fields within the gateway resources.
Yeah, I think we should make sure too that we don't get too far down the custom resource extension point, which makes us even more different between each implementation. I've heard a lot of folks wanting to move to Gateway API, saying, hey, I want to use this because it solves my problems and it's generic. It's a community supported thing. But then if you have too many, I don't have a good answer for it either, but if you have too many CRDs that people can inject, then it ends up being snowflakes again. So yeah, I think it'd be good to figure out, like you said, what might fit in the core and what might be good for extension points, because they'll be so different.
That's a really good point, because this basically just becomes like slightly better than annotations, maybe even worse, because it requires more resources. And like if like everything goes into them, then we've kind of just put ourselves in the exact same place.
Yeah.
So like we need to be judicious about what we actually put in here and try to push as much into core as we can, given like that it can actually be supported pretty broadly. So I think that's an ongoing discussion, which is probably why we should, start coming up with lists and can like on the spectrum of like very custom to very common, where do a lot of these features lie?
Yeah, although like some of those policy objects could be in core, they just exist as different objects.
Yeah, that's a use case I'm pretty interested in. Like if we can take what was backend policy and make it a bit more generic and certainly larger in scope, maybe we have a better model there. So we're not even really creating a new resource type. We're just modifying an existing one.
Yeah, evolving the backend policy, and we already have a couple of use cases there for the next generation of backend policy that we potentially call service policy, right? What it supports currently, which is some of the upstream TLS config, right? Along with potentially adding the connection settings that as a use case Mark brings up here.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, thanks. Yeah, this has been great feedback all around. Look forward to continued discussion either on a doc or on an issue here. And I know we have a few more things on the agenda, so I'll keep on moving. Just a quick highlight here. I was hoping to make some progress on the OOT 3.0 milestone. Most of my time went into recording a KubeCon talk, but there are a couple new updates here, and I know others have been involved as well. Let me highlight just, a couple PRs that I updated recently. One is 592, and Harry had pointed out that I missed Backend Policy, the oft forgotten resource we have. And so I went ahead and added Backend Policy to this list. So I think this PR is good to go now. So if anyone has time to take one more look at it, that would be awesome. The other one is one that's new and one that I discussed earlier. It's an earlier issue that I'd kind of been wanting to take on for a while. And maybe the best way to explain it is if you look at if you've modified docs recently, you notice that we have a really flat structure. And that's fine. It's worked for us so far. But you can imagine as we continue to extend our docs and hopefully make them more thorough, this lack of structure is going to get pretty frustrating. It's already somewhat frustrating to find the file you want to work on. So my idea is really simple. It is to, update that directory to match the site structure, the navigation structure. So just put things in folders to match the navigation patterns that we have. On the surface, I think that seems really straightforward. One of the things that is quite unfortunate about any restructuring is that it's going to break links. So anyone who is, let's say someone's
External links, Rob, or internal links? I'm assuming Netlify will tell us if we broke an internal link.
I don't know that it will, but I think I've fixed. Yes,
yeah, I was concerned about that. Just like internal links would suck.
There's a lot that has to change here. I've changed a bunch, but I'm sure there's more that have to. But the thing I'm concerned about is, okay, say we link to this. What this link would become is contributing/community, right? Because it's now nested under here. So I don't think there's too many external sites linking to anything other than just our root. But if someone was linking to, say, community or say spec, those links would become broken. It's unfortunate, but I also, it's one of those things where if we never change it, more and more people will actually link to the site, and then we'll never change it again because the fear of breaking things. So I think this is an acceptable risk as long as we can ensure. I think there's some tooling we can use to ensure that all our internal links still work. I think that's the majority of links within here. But that is a risk for anything we know that might be linking into this specific doc site. But I'll take a closer look at the internal links. But I wanted to get some feedback. If really just high level, is this a risk we're okay with taking? That
it's better to take it now than later. Like,
right. That's
I'm assuming that like the number of links is only going to go up, not down.
Right.
Yeah, especially if we get this done before KubeCon, because I think that's where we're going to see a jump in interest. So I agree. Let's do it now. I'll take a review of both of these PRs and let's hopefully get it merged. So yeah, as long as none of the internal links are broken, I'm all for moving forward with this PR.
Cool. And let me say that I have not guaranteed yet that all internal links are not broken. I wanted to create this PR and then rely on the Netlify generated content to actually run through and test out the links myself. I think they're upstream. We have maybe it's the docs website has something like that checks for broken links. So I'm also interested to see if we can try and copy that little test so we don't have to manually check these every time. But yeah, cool. Glad to hear that this is reasonable, and hopefully we can get this in soon. It feels like a good time because there's not any huge docs PRs in flight. Obviously, if you're going to make a docs PR, it would conflict with this pretty heavily because this is moving all the things. But hopefully we can get this one in pretty soon.
Rob, let me ask you. I mean, you mentioned about upstream having a kind of a docs links check. Is that something that you think you could look into here in short order? So, what I'm getting at, it would be nice to have something like that as part of this PR to ensure that there is no internal broken links. But, if you feel like that's an undertaking, then in my opinion, I'm willing to accept the risk to make these changes.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's definitely something that I want to at least look into before this PR merges. I am less sure of what's involved because I've just seen the results of it. I can't remember if it's a bot or if it's an actual like pre-commit hook or what is actually implementing it, or maybe I'm remembering wrong. But that is something I want to look into and actually understand, and hopefully it's a pattern that we could copy here, but not sure. But at the very least,
I'm going to hold off on this one until I'll look for like a comment where you just say, hey, I looked into this, and then update the PR with that comment, and then we could figure out how we move forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's the most reasonable way because I still do have a follow-up here I want to do. I want to either make sure myself that all the links I can find are not broken, or have some kind of automation do it. So yeah, I think that's reasonable. I don't think we need reviews right away, but I want to do my own due diligence first, and then I'll ping a couple of you to see if you can review it. Yeah, perfect. All right, let me keep on going here. The other one I wanted to make sure we got to was your validation PR, Danian. This is great. I see there's been a fair amount of reviews, and it seems like this is awfully close now.
Yeah, Bowie, thanks for taking a look at it again. I need to address Bowie's recent comments. But since we spoke last, just as a recap, I believe it was you, Rob, that you said, oh, what would this look like in, from an implementation standpoint? And so I went ahead and updated or added to Christopher's work in progress PR for the validating webhook with what it would look like. And so if you haven't had a chance to look at that, please do. And so, yeah, I'll address Bowie's comments, and then Rob or others would appreciate taking a look at that sample implementation of the webhook, validating webhook, and how it can consume this validation package.
Okay, yeah, this is really cool. Yeah, I missed this, so I will take a closer look at this, but great to see this as an example. I'll follow up right after this meeting. Great. Are there any other PRs or issues that we should try and cover today? I know this one's on me. I need to actually do a little bit more due diligence with API machinery to see if there's, if this is the right compromise to make as far as adding new fields to populate kubectl output. Mark, this getting started refresh, are you waiting on review on this one? Oh, he dropped off.
Yeah, let's try to merge it, because I think it's like pretty big, isn't it?
It is. I'd forgotten this one. Maybe this one just, I'll ping him after this call to double check. Okay. And okay, and I think there were a couple issues that we haven't had time to cover yet. John had a great one, which is, and I experienced this, and I really should have taken some time in today's meeting, because I've gone through all the current implementations I know of that are implementing this API, and for the sake of the KubeCon demo, I ran through using all of them, and it's really cool first to see them all working and working well. But I also want to add that it's interesting to see the little differences between how they're used. So as an example, I think Contour and Traffic, in their examples, the installation includes a gateway class, and in some cases a gateway, whereas Istio's installation doesn't include a gateway class or a gateway. And GKE will include a gateway class, but not gateways, obviously. And so like there's differences in how things are actually bundled. John, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, I think that what you're saying is also very interesting, but I actually was not talking about that here. What I meant was more downstream, like the Grafana Helm chart, Prometheus Helm chart, all these other Helm charts of just normal applications. Today, a lot of them ship with an ingress, right? So you can easily get an ingress with your chart. But in the future, we hopefully will have the gateway API ship with them, and it would be good to kind of explain to people how they should do that. I'm just a bit worried that like some will be like, oh, I'm going to include a gateway, and maybe they shouldn't be including a gateway, but instead a route. And maybe now we have like 10 different ways that people do like the route selection to the gateway. And if we had, some best practices lined out, then maybe there'd be more consistency in the ecosystem. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you have, it would be helpful to see some links. You mentioned Prometheus. Are there other, common, like in the Helm charts repo or elsewhere that are bundling ingress? It'd be useful just to see how that's used.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. I don't use it. I don't use Ingress, so
Yeah, sure.
But if you just grep for Ingress on like the old Helm stable repo, I know it's deprecated now, but like I'm sure there's almost half of them probably have Ingress. I would imagine.
Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah, I'd forgot. Okay, that's a really good point, and that is certainly less straightforward with these APIs. Good point. Okay, cool. Yeah, and so yeah, I guess what I was describing is entirely different here, but it's also just different experiences when provisioning or installing implementations of this API. It's interesting, and I don't know what the best practice is there either. Cool. Okay, the next one, multiple route filters of the same type are supported. I think we actually had said earlier that we did need to support multiple filters of the same type. And Though you're saying that.
Well, for request header modifier.
Okay.
That was
yeah.
the question.
Okay. I got it. Yeah.
Because
yeah.
then it imposes like an ordering, which we said that there was no ordering, and then it'll get confusing.
Right.
Imagine you like delete the same and add.
Do we enforce ordering even within request header modifier? Have we defined what add and remove do in the?
That's a good question. I think we do. First it's delete and then add.
Yeah, that
but
sounds
we have
right.
to double check.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I misunderstood this, but you're right. For request header modifier, we really should encourage single use here. Maybe that's some kind of hint or detail we can add as we're defining the filter type.
I will send a PR if the text isn't clear. And then we should probably, one page we need is basically like a CRD implementer's guide. Yeah. I don't know if we already have that page.
We have an implementation guidelines, but this would be good content to add because I'm pretty sure it's not there. Okay. Cool. Well, thanks for following up on this one. I know we're past time. So yeah, thanks to everyone for the good feedback here. Again, reminders, blog posts will be, draft blog posts will be coming soon for review. Then more feedback on service policy, which I think is going to turn into an issue soon for tracking. And yeah, I think that's it. Thanks to everyone for the great feedback here, and we'll talk to you next week.